tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. All right, so we are in the stream of this Dharma Life Reset idea that we've been doing since the beginning of the year. So we've talked about food and sleep and exercise as real basics to get the to have a ground and a foundation of wellness in our lives as a support for practice, as a support for just being well. And last week we talked a bit about different kinds of exercise, and I just broadly wanted to nod to the different types as a way to say, don't neglect the physical, and also how important exercise of various kinds is, different types of what you could call fitness, endurance fitness that you might get through cardio, strength fitness through weight training of various kinds, or hard physical work, functional training of various kinds, and flexibility of various kinds. And I kind of nodded briefly to yoga in that talk last week, of saying like some forms of yoga touch some of these, but also do many other things, and spoke a little bit to the cultural complexity of yoga and how it sits in Western culture as exercise. And so then I got a little excited to just like, let's talk about yoga. I am, I'm solidly in my, and identity is empty, but I'm solidly in the empty identity of being a Dharma teacher at the moment. But part of my training and practice has been in various Hatha and Bhakti yoga traditions. I started doing yoga in 1995. My first class was a Kripalu style class at Cornell University when I was getting my first, when I was in a year of the first time I tried to get a doctorate. I dropped out. And the best thing I did while I was there was start doing yoga and contact improvisation, and getting a doctorate in music never ended up happening. But when I dropped out of that, went back to Zen, and then left that and ended up in San Francisco to be in the arts world and to see what was possible there. And I started dancing. My dancer friends in San Francisco took me to an Ashtanga studio. If any of you all from the Bay Area know the venerable wild Ashtanga studio called It's Yoga on Folsom Street in the South of Market neighborhood. And it was so I started that in like 1996. And loved that practice, and the practice of moving through the primary series and the kind of abbreviated versions of the primary series we were doing there. And ended up studying with teachers in a bunch of different styles, mostly flow styles, but some other things as well. Got connected with kirtan and bhakti yoga through really through the music that was playing in yoga class, and then started playing and singing and leading that myself, getting connected with the with the Neem Karoli Baba tradition of Ram Dass, but primarily through Krishna Das and Bhagavan Das, the kirtan leaders, and so at the same time as I was doing a lot of long vipassana retreat, initially Zen, and then later vipassana, insight meditation, going to Burma, all of that, I was also doing this is very consistent and consistently deepening practice in what came to be called vinyasa broadly. So styles of flow-based postures that grew out of the Ashtanga tradition of Pattabhi Jois, and really flowered into a form of a kind of a kind of spontaneous, meaning the teachers usually made it up as they were going along, and I did once I was started teaching, a kind of spontaneous choreography of postures, sometimes linked by sun salutation, kinds of gestures, sometimes not. And that really flowered for many, many years, and some of y'all here were, part of my community then. We have been in each other's classes, taken each other's classes. Blessings to all the yogis here, yoga friends. Um, and and as that developed, I found myself at times in some very complicated conversations about what it meant to be doing a posture-based yoga practice and a meditation-based Buddhist practice at the same time, what the relationship of those things was to each other, um, and uh, and for a little while, as the issue of cultural appropriation really exploded in the yoga world, I ended up in the middle of some big conversations, arguments. Uh, I was momentarily harassed slash trolled slash slightly attempted to be canceled by some angry white yoga activists who didn't like the way I was teaching texts. Um, and you know, I got a mysterious phone call from the Hindu America Foundation, which was the right-wing Hindu uh, nationalist kind of group at one point. Blessings to them. Um, and but what it all in a certain way led to was was my taking a pause on kirtan practice and eventually on a pause on kirtan practice because I really wanted to sort out exactly what religion I was in and how I was expressing the very complex postmodern lineages that I had been transmitted. And I ended up pausing on teaching um, physical yoga, um, honestly, only because I needed to make more money for my family. And I went and got a PhD and got a day job behind a desk, which, pays the bills. But I realized quite a while ago that out of all the jobs that I've had, including, being a trauma counselor and a meditation teacher um, and a piano teacher and a, you know, nonprofit administrator as I am now, that I actually enjoyed yoga teaching more than all of them. And I wish I could make a living at it. Um, but um, there you go. I like teaching more or less for free, and I didn't like the industry that it became. And so it fell away. But I have a deep, deep love for it. And one of the things that ended up happening in all of that investigation about what it was that we were doing in the postural practice and in the kind of communal ritual of yoga class, which I do love as a semi-religious, semi-secular, spiritual ritual space, um, that uh, I had to go back and really investigate the roots of the physical practice, partly because I wanted to know how to be in a wise and right and justice-based relationship with the South Asian tradition that acknowledged the relationship of that tradition to the colonial process and to the British colonization process in India and the transmission of the Hindu yogas and other kinds to the West very differently from the transmission of Buddhism and and even the way that Hinduism and Buddhism are very different religions in relation to conversion and transmission. Buddhism is designed to be an evangelical tradition. You are supposed to convert other people to it. It's a religion to be spread, and it can spread across landscapes and cultures in a way very easily. Hinduism was never meant to be spread and evangelized. It doesn't spread across cultures very easily because it's a far more place-based animist tradition than Buddhism is. And so the Hindu gods are local. They are Shiva not as an abstraction, but Shiva who resides on Mount Kailash. And, Ganga not as an abstraction, but the actual river. And, and in this sense, it's, Krishna not as an abstraction, but as, the prince of Vrindavan, the cowherd of Vrindavan. And so, adopting yoga not just as a postural kind of exercise system, but really as a spiritual home, is a different endeavor than adopting something like Buddhism, even a very religious Buddhism, with its roots, strongly in the source tradition, as I'm trying to present here. So tonight, I think I want to, in the context, there's so much to say about this, but in the context of our having begun to talk a little bit about exercise last week and physical practice, I'm going to give a very brief, just sort of touching a few points in the history of yoga as physical practice, and just stir a bit the question of what it might mean to be in wise relationship to this tradition in the physical practice, and some ways that we might understand the physical practice as exercise or healthy, or what actually it does, because the claims for what yoga actually accomplishes physically have changed dramatically over the last 100 years that these practices have been around in the world, and in the globalized culture. So to look at those a little bit. I'm not going to talk about ancient yoga other than to say that the word itself first appears in the Upanishads. It's an ordinary word before that in the Vedas, the ancient texts of the pre-Hindu Brahmanic tradition, where it just means to join or bind, to yoke something together. But it's only in the Upanishads that it begins to refer to a body of practices meant to bring one to awakening or liberation or union with the divine or something like that. And it's defined as all those different things in different places. It's first used in the Haṭha Upanishad, which is either slightly predating the Buddha or slightly post-dating the Buddha, but somewhere between the 4th to 8th century before the Common Era. It's the first text to systematically teach a yoga practice. It's essentially a concentration-based meditation where one uncovers the nature of the self. And developing from there, yoga in the Hindu tradition largely refers to meditative spiritual practices based in deep concentration in stillness. And it means that for another 1,000 years or so until the late medieval period. So in the classical yoga text known as the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, is probably written in about the 4th century of the Common Era, and it's highly likely that it was actually a Buddhist text originally from the Buddhist school known as the Yoga Practice School, Yogacara. And it's again a meditative text. There's nothing in it about postures. Postures as a practice don't arise until the late tantric period. Postures, of course, exist. The Buddha talks about sitting, walking, standing, and lying down, but taking specific shapes of the body as a means to channel energy, which is what yoga is going to become first. That probably first arises in about the 9th or 10th century, again, likely initiating in Buddhist texts, possibly coming out of the Wheel of Time tantric tradition, which is preserved in the Tibetan system now. And as the Kala Chakra. And we first see physical practices called that eventually are going to get kind of subsumed or going to become Hatha yoga. The word Haṭha, H-A-T-H-A, there's a dot under the T, which makes it T. So it's not Haṭha, but because there's no th in Sanskrit, but it's Haṭha. So the Haṭha yoga position tradition, Haṭha means forceful, and it probably means forcing the energy of Kundalini into the central channel. And it first gets developed in probably the 10th or 11th century. Some of the earliest texts are like a text known as the Amrita Siddhi, the power of divine nectar, something like that. You can find a good new translation of the Amrita Siddhi by scholar and practitioner James Mallinson. He did it for his doctorate a decade ago or so. And for a lot on these early traditions, the best source book around now is Mallinson and Singleton's source book, The Roots of Yoga, from Penguin Classics. Tons of excerpts on many, many, many different aspects of yoga and text excerpts all the way back to the Buddha and forward. So the very first practices that get called Haṭha are practices that we would now call mudra. They are 3 particular gestures for channeling energy in the body. One is called Mahamudra, where you extend one leg sitting, hold the leg, hold the breath in really deeply and squeeze everything, channeling energy into the spinal column, the central column. The second is Mahamudra, the extended leg, Mahabandha, the holding the breath with the 3 locks held in the body. I'll talk about them in a moment. And Mahabeda or Mahaveda, the great piercing, where you lock the legs into full lotus and slam the perineum on the ground several times, kind of bouncing again so these are all designed to awaken Kundalini. The word Kundalini means the coiled one, and it's developed into an image of a goddess in the form of a snake who sleeps coiled 3 times around the base of the spine, or the subtle channel in the pelvis. So there's a correlation with sexual energy, but also with life energy. And there are many different stories about what Kundalini is and how it moves. And they come from different aspects of the culture. And there's several different subtle body stories. So don't get hyperfixated on any one of them and think any other one is wrong. In some of them, Kundalini descends from the sky down through the crown to the pelvis. In other ones, Kundalini awakes in the pelvis and rises up to meet Shiva at the crown. In others, the moon is drawn down through the crown to the heart and then rises up to be the sun, and they go back and forth. In one, Kundalini awakens when the fire of prana is trapped in the belly, and she awakens at the belly center. In another one, a bond in the throat is used to prevent drops of subtle light known as bindu, which is also a form of kind of a sublimation of semen, to drip down from the center of the skull and to stop them from dripping into the belly. All of these different images and stories are an outgrowth of the mystical traditions that developed through the tantras and into the later Middle Ages in South Asia, and they're beautiful and complex, and mostly, if you want to engage with them, the best way I think to engage with them is to find one tradition and a teacher you really like who teaches a very clear system from within them, and do just that for a while, rather than taking them all as like various different meditations. They come from very different traditions, and they don't all mix and match. So just understand the mystical traditions as being visionary, and many of them live in a very interesting crossover. And this is part of what yoga begins to do very beautifully. They live in this sometimes strange, sometimes extraordinary crossover between the subtle or visionary or energetic and the physical. And so one of the things that the Hatha Yoga tradition began to do, and this is the origin of what will later become the postures, is there starts to be this movement between like the 10th and 12th, 13th-ish century, and further, of yogis, sages, experimenters, ascetics, taking practices that in the tantras are a body of texts, start to arise around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. They reach their peak in the 10th or 11th. They keep developing for a little while, but their peak is kind of the millennium between the 3rd and 13th-ish century in the Himalayas and South Asia. They continue in the Himalayas or Himalayas, and get but disappear largely from mainland India with the Mughal Empire, the Islamic empire in South Asia. Both Buddhism and Hinduism and Tantric Hinduism particularly all kind of go underground during the Muslim period, but the Hatha Yoga texts and the teachings actually thrive in the Muslim period. So one of the things that happens in early Hatha Yoga is you get concepts that begin in the tantras probably as meditative or esoteric or visionary ideas, and they get somaticized, they get turned into physical versions. And so one of the most famous of these is Kechari Mudra. Kechari means something like skywalker or skywalking, spacewalking. And its earliest version in the tantras probably means something like taking the light of awareness and turning it in on itself. And you get this gesture even in contemporary like Dzogchen teaching from the Tibetan Buddhists, where the mind turns in to see itself, right? You get very still, very steady. You really focus on what it is to be aware, and then you turn the light of awareness on itself. And this is a very ancient meditative gesture. This is probably what Patanjali is pointing toward also, where Prakriti learns to see you can't look at Purusha, pure awareness, directly. So Prakriti, form, material, the world, awareness, but not pure awareness, material world awareness. It gets close enough, it gets as close to Purusha as it can by entering into samadhi, deep stillness. And then it looks at the stillness as best it can, and you try to get a glimpse of pure awareness. And it's like you're looking at in a mirror, but things get very still and transparent, and you start to get a hint of what pure awareness is like. And a lot of the tantras point toward this as the fundamental experience. How do you get a glimpse of awareness itself? So Kechari begins as this kind of awareness turning on itself gesture in deep meditation. But in the Hatha tradition, it starts to be talked about in relation to this idea that a drop of subtle nectar is dripping down from the center of the head. Modern commentators will say, oh, it's from the pineal gland. That's a 20th century idea. Maybe it's true, who knows? But the esoteric texts say it drips down from the center of the head, and you don't want it to fall in the fire, the Agni, the fire in the belly, lest it get burnt up, because preserving semen is life. And this is where you get the beginning of what 20th century neo-tantric folks will focus on obsessively, preserving semen, so preventing ejaculation in men in sex, which is not really a medieval tantric idea, but it's hinted at in some of this literature. In the medieval tantras, there were sexual tantras. In some of them, semen is resisted. In other ones, both parties to the sexual act are meant to ejaculate so that the fluids can be imbibed ritually. So that's a different side of medieval sexual tantra. Hatha is probably the most sexual of the early of the medieval systems, and it's actually Hatha is where all the sex stuff shows up, not so much in classical tantra. But the idea in the tantras of this drop of bindu, sublimated semen from the center of the head, dropping down toward the gut, the way you stop it is by not letting it drop down. And so then some yogis invent this maneuver where you slowly cut away the lingual frenulum, which is the ligament connecting your tongue to the base of your mouth, so that your tongue can get really long. And there's all this stuff in the early Haṭha texts about milking the tongue, where you grab it with a cloth and you yank on it really hard. The tongue is one of the ancient yogic mysteries. Who knows? There's lots of speculation about it. But all the way back in the Buddhist texts, so in the Pali Canon, the earliest Buddhist texts, there are stories about the Buddha when he wants to prove to someone he's a very special kind of person. He shows them this particular special skill, which is that he can take out his tongue, touch both of his ears and his chin and his forehead with his super long tongue. So there's a tongue thing. And eventually there's the idea that the tongue energetically connects to the root at the perineum, and in some traditions out to the penis. So Kechari mudra then becomes this gesture of cutting away the lingual frenulum so that you can have a really long tongue, and then turning it backwards. You have to do it with your fingers mostly, but you can sort of do it even if you have a frenulum. And you stick your tongue up into the cavity into the nasal cavity behind the mouth to stop the drop of bindu from coming down. And so this turning back of awareness that was a subtle gesture in the tantras becomes this somaticized, completely physical gesture of turning the tongue back and sticking it in the nasal cavity. And so this sublimation actually is the principle, in a way, between that you can almost see operating in the birth of the physical postures. So I knew this wasn't going to be a 20-minute mini history. I've only gotten to the Middle Ages. As the Haṭha tradition develops, you start off with these gestures called mudra that are channeling energy. And soon you get gestures, you get the gestures called bandha. Sometimes they're also called kumbhaka, the breath holding. And these have survived into modern yoga, right? Many of you have practiced mula bandha, the root bond, engaging the pelvic floor. Uddiyana bandha, the upward flying bond, drawing the belly in and up with the breath held out. And Jalandhara bandha, the net bearer in the throat, where the chin is tucked into the chest to seal the throat. And you do these while holding the breath. So these are some of the earliest of the Haṭha practices. And there's several early texts. The Amrita Siddhi is one. The Dattatreya Yoga Shastra is one. There's one that was beloved of the modern Vaishnava teacher, Sri Krishnamacharya, who was the teacher of Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois and Desikachar, the three southern schools of modern yoga. And this is the Yoga Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya was an ancient sage in the Upanishads. This text is probably written in the 10th to 12th century, something like that. So it's relatively early. And then the most well-known of the early yoga texts is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika by Swatmarama. This is from probably the 15th century. This is the Akers translation published. It's a very clean translation, published by a company called Yoga Vidya. But like a lot of folks, I first really studied this text in the in this edition from the Satsang folks, yeah, it's a good translation. His tradition ran into a fair amount of ethical trouble, so I don't recommend it anymore. But some of the books are good. So the Pradipika comes out in about the 15th century, and it's one of these texts that's partly original and partly a compilation. So it's a really good one to study because it kind of brings together everything that was extant at the time. It's Shaiva, so it's devoted to the god Shiva. The yoga traditions broadly come very differently from the Vaishnava and Shiva and Shaiva traditions, and the what's called in India Bauddha, but that means Buddhist, so the Buddhist traditions. And there's a lot of crossover later on, right? There's already crossover in the Haṭha texts, probably beginning in the Buddhist system, and the Amrita Siddhi also might have been a Buddhist text. Buddhist here all means like Himalayan tantric text. And by the way, right, when all of this, when the Muslims invade and take over, and there's the long thriving Mughal empire and the tantras go underground and the Buddhist system almost entirely disappears from South Asia, both are preserved in the Himalayan kingdoms of Tibet and Nepal and Bhutan. And so you actually get Tibetan yoga systems that develop almost completely separately from about the 12th to 14th century onward. So for the next 600 years to the present day, they continue to develop. And you have living Tibetan yoga traditions now that have been not hardly as developed in the West as the Hindu traditions, but that do exist. One of them is the Bon tradition, and it's been popularized as through through Tenzin Wangyal's school. He's still alive, wonderful teacher if you can get some time with him, and kind of taught mostly by his student Alejandro Chaul. So that's his book, Tibetan Yoga. So that's a beautiful version of an extant tantric yoga system preserved in the Himalayas. The other main Tibetan yoga system that's around is Namkhai Norbu's system that he calls Yantra Yoga, which has a lot more influence from complex asana. There's a whole very complex way of thinking about asana, many sets of more 20th century kinds of asana there, but a very different text-based derivation and a very different style of asana, by the way, including the particular detail that almost all the postures in the Tibetan system are meant to be done while the breath is held, rather than with full breathing through it. So you come into a pose and you hold the breath, rather than breathing and doing the kind of, the ongoing breath of either an Iyengar or like Ashtanga kind of tradition. So in the Pradipika, what you get is a summary of what yoga was around at the time, about the 15th century. There's less than a dozen postures, asana, and they're all sitting postures essentially, except for peacock. There's one kind of balance on your hands posture, but they're mostly sitting postures. And we see, however, in the sitting postures, the same theme as we saw like in Khechari Mudra. You start to see physicalized versions of earlier practices that were more energetic. So if in the early tantras, you had the vase breath that we did in the meditation today, where you're breathing in and the body is hollow, but that's just a visualization. And you're filling the body and you're holding the breath energy or the prana in the torso just by intending it, right? You're not squeezing anything particularly. From that, eventually you're going to get Mula Bandha on the bottom, the root bond, so holding the pelvic floor with a bit of muscular engagement. In some traditions, still very subtle. Other traditions, strong. They're just like squeeze. But some traditions are like, gentle loft. I tend to teach it somewhere in between. I like a good squeeze. I also like a gentle loft. And then Jalandhara Bandha, sealing at the throat. So those, they start as subtle, then you can physicalize them as actually squeezing the musculature. And then in the Pradipika, you start to get sitting postures like Siddhasana, the posture of the Siddhas, or the sages with magical powers, the tantric sages. And this is essentially a cross-legged posture with your feet not up on your thighs like in lotus, but just on the ground in front of you, with the detail that your inner foot is so far in that you're sitting on your heel. And so if you have your right foot on the inside, you would put your right heel in your perineum. And I taught this for many years to people with all kinds of bodies. And the report from folks with vaginas is that it's very different than the report from folks without vaginas, but it seems to have been designed for folks without vaginas to put your heel in your perineum. But it can work for both, depending on how you put your foot. And we've gone from the holding the pelvic floor just as a gesture, as an energetic gesture and a visualization, to holding it with muscular engagement, to actually putting your heel there and sitting on it. And so this is part of this somaticizing process that will eventually lead to more and more profusion of postures. And what the Pradipika mostly is about is pranayama, and it details all the different holds, the different types of pranayama. Alternate nostril breath, nadi shodhana, is there. Different kinds of, bellows breath is there. All of these pranayamas were preserved into the 20th century. So if you did yoga anytime in the sort of 90s or aughts, you probably learned these. They have been falling away as other kinds of yoga have taken dominance. How often do you do bee breath anymore in yoga class? But some of you, have done it. And so I'll speak about this more next week, and we can do more of the modern history if you want it. But the short, summary of the rest, in a way, is that this process of somaticization keeps going. And as, by the late 16th and into the 17th century, the British have defeated the Mughal Empire. And so now there's a British Empire in India instead of an Islamic one. And with the Brits comes not just Christianity, but all of the accoutrements of Christianity, which include like calisthenics and physical exercise of various kinds, and just influence from Europe in general. And so through the 17th and 18th and 19th century, texts continue to get written on yoga, including some very late Upanishads. They still get called Upanishads. Texts start to arise. And an early one in the sequence is the Garanda Samhita, which has like 32 postures in it, a little bit more, and they're more physicalized than in the Pradipika. And then a relatively late one, 18th, 19th century, the Shiva Samhita, that has a much more developed physical practice. And then we get into the beginnings of the 20th century. And what we have by the beginning of the 20th century is, many dozen yoga postures, where, in the 15th century, there was only about a dozen, and they were all seated. So we have the beginnings of standing postures, right? The beginnings of postures where you need some strength to apply them. And I'll end tonight with Krishnamacharya and the response to colonialism, because there's one version of the story of the profusion of yoga asana in the 20th century that says that in the South particularly, and Krishnamacharya was in Mysore, in the center south of India, that there started to grow a resistance movement against the British that understood that in a very colonial kind of way, began to understand itself. So Indian folks understanding themselves as weaker in a certain way than the British overlords. They were a dominated people at that time. And there started to be a movement of fitness, to kind of develop the Indian, warrior psyche more, and bodies. And there were very overtly, descriptions of like, we need to strengthen ourselves, to be a stronger people in the modern times and eventually throw off the yoke of tyranny. And so these traditional Haṭha practices and exercises began to get mixed with various kinds of European exercises, including YMCA exercises taught by Christian missionaries, Swedish calisthenics, also circus work and contortion came in with European circuses, and some of the most extreme of the contortion postures in modern yoga can be traced to colonial circuses coming through and these practices being adopted, but also many ancient practices like these early bandhas and mudras are preserved. And two schools develop. One, a Vaishnava school in the south of India, centered around Mysore and the teachings of Sri Krishnamacharya, who venerated the Yoga Sutras, but taught a very physicalized practice of breathing into and out of single postures. That's where the word vinyasa comes from. And then that gets developed by his student, Pattabhi Jois, into Ashtanga, and by his other student, Iyengar, into the hyper-prop-oriented Iyengar practice, and eventually developed by his closest longtime student, Desikachar, into a modern practice very much closer to what Krishnamacharya was actually teaching. And in the north, in Rishikesh, Swami Śivānanda begins to teach a much more Shaiva Hindu devotional yoga with a much smaller set of postures embedded in a much more traditional Hindu setting. And this becomes Śivānanda Yoga, which gives birth to integral and a number of other traditions from the north. So I'll pause there for tonight, and maybe next week we'll take up, the 20th century and colonialism and, power yoga and all of those things. Hi, I hope this material has been helpful for your practice. If you are moved to support my work and the community that has gathered around this stream of practice, you can do so. There are donation links in the description, and subscribing helps the channel. So thank you for your support as we grow this Dhamma offering, and I wish all the best to you. Feel free to comment and ask questions below, and I'll answer them if I can. See you.